Today we're going to talk a little bit about World War II, some of the end game, shall we say, of World War II. So today, because A, we're talking about World War II, and B, because it's cold, I'm wearing my Jeep cap. So I'm getting into the feeling of the whole thing. Anyway, World War II, of course, the way we look at it from 2020 hindsight, it progressed logically, exactly as it should have. However, there's a lot of places where it could have gone very, very differently. So let's explore some of those things that could have happened. A couple of schools of thought on that. One, of course, is that this was the least brutal way, for us, certainly. Operation Olympic was slated to cost 1 million American casualties. My father, when he was in the Army in World War II, was stationed on Saipan, and they were building General Hospital Number 10, which expected to take most of those casualties. And it was going to be really, really expensive if we invaded Japan. I spoke to my brother's father-in-law, a gentleman by the name of Bob Garrison, who was a Marine in World War II. And he was with the 1st Marine Division, which was slated to make a diversionary attack. He said that intelligence said that there would be stopped by, or tried to be stopped by, 5 Japanese divisions. Turned out there were 20 Japanese divisions where they were going to land. And you don't reinforce diversionary attacks, so they were all going to die. Furthermore, the Japanese were really not interested in unconditional surrender. So the one school of thought is that, well, we didn't want to have to kill every Japanese there was by hand. We didn't want to lose 100,000 American soldiers and 1 million casualties. So, yeah. There's another school of thought, though, that's come to recent highlight in scholarship. That is that the Japanese actually were putting out peace feelers at the time. By our firebombing of Tokyo and various other cities in Japan, they were ready to quit. But our demand for unconditional surrender was the stick in their craw, and the only bit about it was they didn't want us hanging Emperor Hirohito. As it turned out, they surrendered unconditionally, and we didn't hang Hirohito anyway. So, in that regard, there's a strong probability that dropping 2 nuclear bombs on Japan was unnecessary. On the other hand, it did, well, those are the only 2 that have ever been dropped, and it was a laudable lesson as to what the results of such a thing were, and it also proved to the Russians that we had more than one. And there was that. A lot of it, I think, really was to prove to the Russians that we could zap them out of existence if we wanted to. I would say the Russians raising the red flag over the Reichstag. The Russian army won that war. We helped a lot, bombing Germany night and day by the British Royal Air Force and the American 8th Air Force. We did a lot of damage to the German war effort. Not as much as we thought, but it was primarily the Red Army just pounding the Germans into dust, or into mud, as the case may be. We got to remember that the Russians lost pretty much as many men taking Berlin as we lost in the whole war. Like 300,000 guys. That was a huge, huge loss. Well, there's no absolute proof that he died there. There were witnesses who saw the fact that he poisoned his dog, and they heard shot, but nobody ever saw the body, of his body at least, provable. None of the surviving witnesses did. the supposed skull fragments that the Russians had, proven since to be female, some woman. Who knows? There was a lot of submarine activity going on that the Allies, the Western Allies, kind of let go through. So we really don't know. There's some circumstantial evidence to suggest that Hitler did survive. There were rumors forever that he was running around Argentina. And there certainly was a large German immigrant community in Argentina to hide him in. Argentina was anything but, but pro-British, certainly, and probably not particularly pro-American either. And so it's certainly plausible. I haven't seen anything that is definitive either direction. Well, Germans weren't. We hanged a whole lot of Japanese officers and officials as well. Tojo was the prime minister. We hanged him high. So it's just that the Nuremberg trials were much more public, I guess, much more international. Because Japan, we were the only ones who went in and occupied Japan. The Russians, we tried to get the Russians in to that war at the very end because, well, if we were going to invade it, we needed help. We'd rather waste Russian soldiers than American soldiers, which is exactly what Stalin thought we were doing anyway in Europe. But bottom line is that the Russians took the Kuril Islands, and that was about all they got. We occupied the rest of Japan. Therefore, it was a totally 100% American. Maybe the British were involved a little bit, but not much in trying the Japanese for war crimes. And the Nuremberg trials, I think there was a lot more legalism going on in Nuremberg too. The Germans probably had a little bit better defense attorneys, should I say. Japanese, well, they're pretty fatalistic, especially the military, and they probably just thought, well, we're going to be hanged, so there it is. Something I want to point out too is that both the United States and Japan were fighting two completely different wars at the same time. One of our wars was, of course, against Japan, and the other was against Nazi Germany and Italy. The Japanese, on the other hand, were fighting one war against the United States, and their other war was against China. So we have the Japanese Navy versus the U.S. Navy, for the most part, in the Pacific, and then the U.S. Army versus the German Army, to some extent, with British, Canadian, and tons of Russian help. And then the Chinese, or should I say the Japanese fighting the Chinese, that was an entirely Japanese Army production. And the Japanese Army was hardly ever engaged. I mean, very, very little of the Japanese Army was engaged against the United States. They had invaded Thailand and Burma. Of course, they invaded Vietnam in French Indochina, moved through Thailand and into Burma to threaten India. And so the British, to a major extent, and us to a much more minor extent, were involved against the Japanese army on the continent of Asia. But it was the Japanese against the Chinese, both the communists and the nationalists, the Kuomintang armies, that absorbed the Japanese army's interest. The United States, of course, supplied the Kuomintang army of Chiang Kai-shek with lots and lots of supplies over the Himalaya mountains. They called it flying over the hump. We pretty much pushed it through by air. It wasn't until fairly late in the war that the Burma Road was completed, and that was one of the reasons that we sent Merrill's Marauders in to help out the British Chindits in Burma to push the Japanese aside so that we could supply Chiang's forces. We really didn't supply the communists very much, of course, and a lot of the supplies that we sent to Chiang and the Kuomintang army were were stashed away for the Civil War they knew was going to come after the Japanese were defeated. But frankly, the communists were a whole lot more interested in fighting the Japanese than the Kuomintang army was, than the so-called nationalists. It was very, very interesting. Now, another thing that is widely forgotten is that at the very end of World War II, when we were trying to get the Russians to join us in defeating the Japanese and the home islands, the Russians sent their armies to the east, and they waxed the Japanese badly in North China. Actually, in fact, in 1940, 39, thereabouts, the Japanese thought that they would take on the Russians because, well, they defeated the Russians in 1905. They could probably do it again. The Russians proved them completely mistaken because the Japanese army of 1939, even in 42, was a 1914 army. They had really good rifles and infantry. They did not have much in the form of tanks and infantry support stuff. I mean, that would have done well against Germany or France in 1914. Against the Russians in 1939, they had several divisions just annihilated in Manchuria. I think there's only one way that the Axis could have won the war, and that would have been had Germany been able to develop nuclear weapons. They were definitely on their way, and had not Niels Bohr gotten the word and gotten it to Einstein that the Germans were working on that, we probably wouldn't have done it either. But I think the only scenario, reasonable scenario, would be that the Germans managed to perfect or get any kind of nuclear weapon off the ground. The first thing they'd have to do would be annihilate Moscow. They would have had to have bombed the snot out of the Russians first to get them out of the picture, because the Russians aren't quitters, and that just wasn't gonna. The Russians weren't gonna quit unless they were pummeled into it by overwhelming force. And then the Germans would have had to smash Britain too. I think in Man in the High Castle, they're talking about some nuclear weapons being detonated in like either DC or New York or both. And that's about what it would take, but it would still be a rough slog for the United States to actually surrender. I can see the Japanese, I mean, the United States fleet, had they not started this early, had the Germans not developed nuclear weapons early enough, I don't see how they could have done it at all. Because they'd have had to have first off knocked the Russians out before they had too many losses against the Russians, and they'd have had to convince the British to surrender before they nuked them. I don't think the British would have submitted to being nuked. They would have surrendered first. But I don't think the United States would have, because we've got two oceans between us. You know, we got an ocean between us and the Germans, an ocean between us and the Japanese, and the United States Navy, for all its faults of 1941, it would have been very rough. It would have been very difficult. And even had we been nuked, even had New York and D.C. and San Francisco been nuked by the Axis powers, I don't see the American population submitting to that. Certainly not the 1940s American population. Maybe today, but 1940, no way, no way. We'd just come out of the Depression. We were used to some deprivation, and virtually every man knew how to use a rifle in 1940 in the United States. The Japanese may have thought that we were fat and lazy. They were proved wrong. No, it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened. We didn't have safe spaces in 1941, and certainly not in 1944. So I don't think it would have happened. It's just a little bit too much. But it's a kind of a neat way to looking at things and to explore what would have happened.
Cat. Meow.